The crows told Koa Redhawk that someone was dying. They were never wrong. He'd lived in the high lonesome long enough to learn the land's language, and the frantic circle of black wings over the lower ridge was a sentence he knew by heart. Death had come to lie down in the snow. He pulled his collar up, his breath a ghost in the freezing air, and turned his horse. The world had gone white and silent, just the way he liked it. In winter, the mountains kept their secrets and left an old Apache to his. Smoke from his chimney was the only proof he still existed, a thin gray line against a sky the color of slate. He liked it that way. Ghosts were better company than people. At least they knew when to stay quiet. But the crows kept screaming. He rode toward the sound, the snow growing deeper, the wind cutting like a razor. By the time he reached the hollow, the storm was a roaring beast, and that's when he saw it. A wagon, half swallowed by a snowdrift, its canvas ripped open like a wound in the white landscape. The horse hitched to it was a statue of ice, its eyes wide and glazed. Another soul the prairie had claimed. He almost turned back. It was the land's way, and he wasn't one to argue. But then he heard it. A sound so faint it was barely there. Thinner than the wind, a single, ragged breath. He slid from his horse, his boots sinking deep, and fought his way to the wagon. He ripped back the frozen canvas flap, his knuckles raw and bleeding. Inside, a woman was curled under a wool blanket stiff with ice. Her skin was the color of ash. Her lips were cracked and blue. In her hand, she clutched a rosary, the beads frozen to her skin. She couldn't have been more than 30, but the cold had already stolen the youth from her face. He thought she was gone. Another body to bury come spring. But then her eyes fluttered open. They were blue, a sharp, frightened blue that held too many stories. He didn't say a word. He just lifted her from the wagon. She weighed almost nothing. The snow fought him with every step, but he walked steady, each breath a promise he didn't know he was making. He carried her for an hour, the wind tearing at them, his old bones screaming in protest. He laid her by the fire in his cabin, stripping the frozen coat from her shoulders, wrapping her in every blanket he owned. Her breathing was a shallow, fragile thing. He heated snow in a tin cup and poured the warm water between her lips. And then he waited. The storm pressed against the cabin, rattling the shutters, as if it wanted its prize back. Hours later, her eyes opened again. She looked around the small cabin, at the rough-hewn table and the shelves of preserved food, like someone trying to remember which world she'd woken up in. "You'll live," he said. His voice was gravel, rough from disuse. She tried to sit up, her body trembling. "The horse," she whispered. I thought I'd die." "You near did," he said, turning his back to her to stir the fire. He didn't ask her name. He didn't want it. A name was a hook. It caught in your chest and never let go. He'd learned that lesson the hard way. He ladled broth into a bowl and set it beside her. "Eat." She obeyed, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the spoon. Her eyes scanned the room, taking everything in, the worn saddle in the corner, the neat stack of firewood. And then they landed on the one photograph he kept on the mantel, a faded image of a woman with 2 small children. "Your family?" she asked, her voice soft. "Gone," he said. The word was a stone dropped into a well. It ended the conversation. She lowered her eyes and murmured an apology. He pretended not to hear it. That night, she slept by the hearth, and he lay on his cot across the room, wide awake. It had been years since the sound of another person's breathing had filled his home. It felt like a trespass. Like hope, a thing he'd buried long ago, had clawed its way out of the frozen ground. He didn't trust it. He didn't trust her. Because as she slept, she whispered a name in the dark. A name he hadn't heard in 30 years. A name that belonged to a dead man. The storm didn't break for 3 days. The world was a wall of white. Inside, a quiet war was being fought, a war of silence and suspicion. Her name was Lydia. She told him that on the second morning, her voice small but steady. He just nodded. He didn't offer his own. A name was a key, and he had no intention of letting her unlock anything inside him. She was getting stronger. Color was returning to her cheeks. She moved around the cabin with a quiet purpose, sweeping the floor, mending his shirts without being asked. She was trying to make herself useful, trying to earn her keep. But Koa watched her. He watched her a lot. He saw the way her eyes would drift to the faded photograph on the mantel. He saw how she'd pause, her hand hovering over the image of his dead wife and children. There was something in her gaze that wasn't simple curiosity. It was something else. Recognition. And then there was the rosary. He'd managed to pry it from her frozen fingers that first day. It was old, the silver worn smooth. But carved into the back of the crucifix was a symbol. An insignia he knew. It was the mark of a U.S. Army surgeon's unit, a unit that had been wiped out decades ago, a unit he had tried to forget. Every move she made felt like a test. Every question she asked felt like a trap. "You live alone here?" she'd asked. "Long enough," he'd grunted. She tried again later. "I was traveling west," she said, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea. "To Fort Stanton. My father, he was a surgeon in the war." Koa kept his eyes on the fire, his face a mask of stone. "Many men were." "Yes," she said softly, "but he told me stories about this land, about a man who saved him when his unit was ambushed, an Apache scout. He said the man was a giant, with eyes that didn't fear death." The air in the cabin grew thick. The wind howled outside, a low, mournful sound. Koa stood and shoved another log into the fire, the muscles in his back tight. He could feel her watching him, waiting. He knew what she was doing. She was laying a trail of breadcrumbs, trying to lead him into a past he had burned to the ground. But why? Who was this woman? Was she the daughter of a man he'd known? Or was this something else entirely? A trick. A debt come to collect after all these years. He wouldn't take the bait. "You should eat," he said, changing the subject. She didn't press him, but the certainty in her eyes was unnerving. It was as if she already knew the answer and was just waiting for him to be man enough to admit it. That night, the quiet in the cabin felt different. It wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, coiled. He lay on his cot, pretending to sleep, his hand resting on the knife he kept under his pillow. He listened to her breathing, to the soft rustle of blankets as she shifted by the fire. He was an old warrior, and he knew an ambush when he felt one. He just didn't know what kind it was. He was waiting for her to make her move, for the other shoe to drop, for the reason she was really here to finally reveal itself. Around midnight, he heard her stir. She sat up, her silhouette a dark shape against the dying embers of the fire. "Do you ever get tired?" she whispered into the darkness, "of pretending you're already gone?" His eyes snapped open. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. "I can hear it in the way you walk," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "Like you're afraid to wake the past, like you're a ghost in your own home." Slowly, he sat up. The blanket pooled around his waist. In the dim light, he could just make out her face. She wasn't afraid. "You talk too much for a woman who almost froze to death," he rasped. A small, sad smile touched her lips. "Maybe freezing taught me something. That warmth isn't just something you find in a fire. It's something you have to let in." He stared at her across the room, the years stretching between them like a canyon. Her words were a direct hit, striking at the very foundation of the life he had built. This fortress of solitude, this kingdom of ice. He couldn't stand it. He couldn't stand her seeing him, truly seeing him. Without another word, he stood, pulled on his coat and boots, and walked out the door, letting the storm swallow him whole. He needed the cold. He needed the wind to scour her words from his mind. But as he stood in the blinding snow, Her voice echoed in his head. Pretending you're already gone. When he finally returned, hours later, chilled to the bone, the fire was burning brightly, and she had left a blanket folded neatly on the chair closest to the hearth. An invitation, or maybe a challenge. He sat, the warmth seeping into him against his will. He didn't know who this woman was or what she wanted from him, but he knew one thing for certain. She was dangerous. More dangerous than any storm, any winter, any memory, because she was starting to melt the ice around a heart he thought had frozen solid long ago. And he had no idea what he would find underneath. The thaw came slowly, both outside and in. The snow began to recede, revealing patches of frozen earth. The sun, a stranger for weeks, started to win its battle against the clouds. And inside the cabin, the suffocating silence began to crack. Lydia stopped asking questions about the past. Instead, she filled the quiet with other things. The smell of bread baking in the hearth, a scent he hadn't known in years. The sound of her humming a tune he didn't recognize but found himself listening for. She brought small pieces of life back into his tomb. A ribbon tied to the window latch. A wildflower she found during a brief melt, placed in a cup of water on the table. Koa tried to ignore it. He tried to hold on to his solitude, to the familiar comfort of his grief. He worked from sunup to sundown, chopping wood, mending fences, trying to sweat her presence out of his system. But it was no use. She was there when he returned, a quiet and steady warmth waiting for him. One evening, he found her by the juniper tree. She was brushing snow off the small, weathered stone that marked his wife's grave. He stopped, his heart clenching. That was sacred ground. No one went there. Her name was Naima, he said, his voice rougher than he intended. Lydia didn't startle. She didn't turn around. It's a beautiful name. Died in the second winter here, he continued, the words tasting like ash. The land takes what it wants. And it keeps what it's given, she said, her voice a whisper. Sometimes I think the people we lose are still here, in the wind, in the quiet. She finally turned to face him, the moonlight catching the silver streaks in her hair. Maybe you're not as alone as you think. For the first time, he didn't look at her as an intruder or a mystery. He looked at her as someone who understood, someone who also knew the language of loss. The air between them shifted, thin and fragile, like the first crack in a frozen river. He broke the moment, turning back toward the cabin. It's getting cold. He walked away, but he could feel her eyes on his back. That night, the silence wasn't a weapon. It was a shared space, a fragile truce, but the truce couldn't last. The mystery of her arrival still hung between them. He knew she hadn't told him the whole truth. He could feel it. The way she avoided talking about where she was from, beyond a vague mention of back east. The way she never spoke of her mother, the way she'd flinch if he moved too quickly. This wasn't just a woman caught in a storm. This was a woman running from something. His suspicions came to a head a week later. The main road was finally clear enough for travel. He'd been preparing for it, dreading it. He'd give her supplies, point her toward Fort Stanton, and his life would go back to the way it was. Silent, empty, safe. He came inside from saddling one of the horses for her journey and found her packing a small bundle, but she wasn't packing the food he'd laid out. She was wrapping up the faded photograph from his mantle. Ice flooded his veins. "What are you doing?" She spun around, her eyes wide with a fear he hadn't seen since the day he found her. She clutched the photograph to her chest. I was just looking at it." "That's my wife," he growled, stalking toward her. "My children. Put it back." Tears welled in her eyes. Her hands were trembling. "I know," she whispered. "How could you know?" He demanded, his voice a low threat. She finally looked at him, her face a mask of desperation and sorrow. Because the woman in that photograph is my mother's older sister. The world tilted on its axis. The floor beneath Koa's feet seemed to drop away. He stared at her, at the familiar line of her jaw, the shape of her eyes. It was there, the resemblance. Faint, but there. He'd been blind to it, or maybe he hadn't wanted to see it. My Aunt Naima, Lydia continued, her voice breaking. She ran away from home years ago with an Apache scout. My family disowned her. They told us she was dead. But my mother, she never believed it. She spent her whole life looking for her. He couldn't speak. He couldn't breathe. Naima's family, here, in his cabin, after all these years. My father wasn't a surgeon, she confessed, the tears flowing freely now. He was a gambler, a drunk. He was cruel. My mother died last year. Before she did, she gave me this. She pulled the rosary from her pocket. It belonged to my aunt, and she told me to find her, to find out what happened. I sold everything I had. I followed rumors, whispers, until I ended up in that wagon. It was too much. The past he had buried under 30 years of snow and silence was erupting. This woman wasn't just a stranger, she was family, his wife's blood, his children's cousin, and she had brought the outside world, the world that had taken everything from him, crashing through his door. Why didn't you tell me? He finally managed to ask, his voice hollow. I was afraid, she wept. I saw the look in your eyes, the pain. I saw the grave outside. I knew she was gone. I didn't want you to hate me for bringing it all back up. He stumbled back, leaning against the wall for support. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not a threat, but a reflection of his own loss. A loss he now knew was shared. He had built his walls so high to keep the pain out, but he had also kept life out. And now life, in the most impossible, heartbreaking way, had found him. It had a name. It was Lydia. And it was standing in the middle of his room, holding the ghost of his wife in her hands. The confession shattered the fragile peace of the cabin. It wasn't just Lydia's past that had been revealed. It was his own, unearthed and bleeding in the small space between them. Koa felt like a man standing on the edge of a cliff he didn't know was there. You should have left it buried, he said, the words heavy and cold. I couldn't, Lydia whispered, her eyes pleading with him to understand. She was my family. You were my family. I had to know. You know now, he said, turning away from her. He couldn't look at her. Seeing Naima's eyes in her face was like a knife twisting in his gut. The road is clear. You can go to Fort Stanton. Tell them what you found. It's over. Is it? She challenged, her voice finding a sliver of strength. Does knowing she's gone make it over? Does it make your loneliness any easier? Or mine? He slammed his hand on the table, the sound cracking through the room like a gunshot. You know nothing of my loneliness. I know it looks just like mine, she cried out. I've been alone my whole life, Koa. First with a father who didn't want me, and then with no one at all. I came here looking for a ghost, looking for a piece of a story. I didn't expect to find someone still living it. Her words hung in the air, sharp and true. He had been living in a memory, a walking monument to his own grief. He had mistaken that for loyalty, for honor. But maybe it was just fear, the fear of starting over, the fear of letting someone else in, only to lose them again. He felt a sudden, suffocating need to escape, to get out, to be where the wind could howl louder than the thoughts in his head. I'm riding out, he said, grabbing his coat. Where? Lydia asked, a note of panic in her voice. To check the north fence line. The thaw can weaken the posts. It was a lie, an excuse. Koa, don't, she begged, stepping in front of the door. Don't run from this. Don't run from me. He looked down at her, at this impossible woman who was both a stranger and his kin, who had brought his past crashing into his present. He saw the strength in her, the same stubborn fire that had burned in Naima, and it terrified him. "This place wasn't made for two," he said, his voice softer now, weary. "It wasn't made for one either," she replied, her hand reaching out, almost touching his arm before she pulled it back. "But you stayed. Because there was nowhere else left to go." The admission was raw, torn from a place deep inside him. Her gaze was steady, unwavering. "And maybe that's what brought me here too." He couldn't fight her. He couldn't fight the truth in her words. So he did the only thing he knew how to do. He retreated. He gently moved her aside, opened the door, and stepped out into the cold, clear air. He rode for hours, pushing his horse hard, trying to outrun the storm that was raging inside him. He rode until the sun began to dip below the mountains, painting the snow in shades of orange and purple. He finally stopped on a high ridge overlooking his cabin. Smoke curled from the chimney, a lonely signal in the vast wilderness. She was still there, waiting. He had a choice. He could keep riding, disappear into the mountains, and let the silence reclaim him. Or he could turn back. He could face the ghost she had awakened. He could face her. For 30 years, he had chosen solitude. He had convinced himself it was strength. But as he looked at that thin ribbon of smoke, he wondered if true strength wasn't in enduring the cold, but in having the courage to walk back into the warmth. He didn't know if he had that courage. He had lived with ghosts for so long, he wasn't sure he remembered how to live with the living. He thought of her face, the desperation and hope warring in her eyes. He thought of Naima and the life they were supposed to have. He had run once before. After Naima and the children died, he had run from his people, from his past, from himself. He had ended up here, in this beautiful, desolate prison of his own making. Was he going to run again? The wind whipped around him, cold and unforgiving. It carried the scent of pine and melting snow. It felt like a question. He closed his eyes, his heart a painful, heavy beat in his chest. When he opened them again, he had his answer. He turned his horse around and started back. He didn't know what he would say. He didn't know what would happen. He only knew that for the first time in a very long time, the silence he was riding toward didn't feel like peace. It felt like an ending he was no longer willing to accept. But as he rode closer, he saw something that made the blood run cold in his veins, footprints in the snow. Leading away from the cabin, not just one set, two, and a third, a heavy drag mark, as if someone was being pulled. Lydia was gone. Panic, an emotion Koa hadn't felt in decades, seized him. It was sharp and hot, a wild animal clawing at his insides. He spurred his horse into a gallop, the last few hundred yards a blur of flying snow and pounding hooves. He leaped from the saddle before the horse even stopped, his rifle in his hand. The cabin door was ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. The inside was a wreck. The table was overturned, the chair he'd built was smashed, and on the floor, near the hearth, was a single, dark red smear in the wood. Blood. And Lydia's rosary lay beside it, its chain snapped. He burst back outside, his eyes scanning the tracks. 2 men. Heavy boots. They hadn't tried to hide their trail. They were arrogant, or they were in a hurry. The tracks led east toward the low pass. Rage, cold and pure, settled over him. He had spent his life running from the world of men. Now, it had come to his door. It had taken the one thing that had made him feel human again. It had taken his family. He didn't hesitate. He checked his rifle, grabbed a spare box of cartridges, and slung a small pack over his shoulder. He wasn't the old man hiding from his memories anymore. He was the warrior he had been, the scout who could read the land like a book, the man his enemies had once called Ghost of the Mountain. They had made a mistake. They thought they were taking a helpless woman from a forgotten old man. They didn't know they had just awakened a sleeping giant. And he was coming for them. The hunt was on. Koa moved like a phantom through the pines, the setting sun at his back casting long, distorted shadows. The tracks were fresh, no more than a few hours old. The men were clumsy, city men by the look of their stride, unused to the high country. They were pushing hard, dragging Lydia with them. He could see where she'd struggled, where the snow was scuffed and trampled. The sight fueled the fire in his belly. He knew this land. Every ridge, every ravine, every game trail. They were heading for the old Trapper's Pass, the quickest way out of the valley. But quick didn't mean easy, and it didn't mean safe. He didn't follow their trail directly. That was for amateurs. He cut north, climbing to a higher ridge that ran parallel to their path. From here, he could move faster, unseen, and look down on them. He moved with a speed and silence that defied his years, his body remembering the old rhythms of the hunt. The cold air burned his lungs, but he didn't feel it. The pain in his old joints vanished. There was only the trail and the rage that drove him forward. An hour before dusk, he saw them. Two figures, black against the snow, moving slowly through a thicket of aspen below, and a third, smaller figure being half dragged, half carried between them. Lydia. Even from this distance, he could see the fight in her, the way she kicked and struggled. His first instinct was to raise his rifle, to end it right there. But it was too risky. The range was long, the light was failing, and Lydia was too close to them. A missed shot could hit her. No. He had to be smarter. He had to be patient. The warrior inside him took over. He assessed the terrain. They were heading into a narrow canyon just ahead. The walls were steep, the path winding. A perfect place for an ambush. A perfect place to become a ghost. He raced ahead, moving through the trees like the wind, his moccasins making no sound on the crusted snow. He reached the canyon entrance minutes before they did and found his spot. A rocky outcropping 20 feet above the trail, shrouded in shadow and overgrown with juniper. From here, he would have a clear shot. They would never see him coming. He lay flat on the cold rock, his breathing controlled, his heartbeat a slow, steady drum. He became part of the mountain. He listened. He waited. The sound of their voices reached him first. Rough, angry words. Just keep her moving. He'll pay. The old man will pay a fortune to get his pretty little wife back. The second man laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. If he even follows. Looked half dead to me. Probably sitting by his fire, thanking us for taking her off his hands. So that was it. A ransom. They thought he was some rich hermit. They had seen Lydia, seen a cabin, and seen an opportunity. Fools. They entered the canyon. The bigger of the two men was in the lead. The second man had Lydia by the arm, dragging her along. Her head was down, her hair covering her face. Koa centered the rifle's sight on the first man's chest. He took a slow breath, let half of it out, and held it. The world narrowed to the space between the sight and his target. He let the first man walk past his position. He waited until the second man, the one holding Lydia, was directly below him. This was the moment. Everything depended on this. He didn't aim for the man. He aimed for the rock face just beside his head. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report was deafening in the narrow canyon, echoing off the rock walls like a clap of thunder. A shower of rock chips and dust exploded from the wall, right in the second man's face. The man screamed, stumbling back, his hands flying up to his eyes. He let go of Lydia. "Get down!" Lydia screamed, throwing herself to the ground. The first man spun around, confused, raising his pistol. "Where did that come from?" Koa was already moving. He fired a second shot, this one kicking up snow at the first man's feet. It wasn't meant to hit him. It was meant to hurt him. The man panicked, firing his pistol wildly into the shadows above. That's when Koa whistled. A short, sharp sound, like a hawk's cry. On the ridge above the canyon's far side, his horse, trained for years, whinnied loudly and kicked a cascade of loose rocks and snow down into the canyon. It was chaos. The gunshots were still echoing. The rocks were clattering down. The men were yelling, completely disoriented. They thought they were surrounded. In that moment of confusion, Koa slid down from his perch, landing silently on the trail behind them. The second man was still rubbing his eyes, trying to see. The first man was looking up at the ridge where the rocks had fallen. Neither of them saw the ghost appear from the shadows. Koa moved. He brought the butt of his rifle down hard on the back of the first man's head. The man dropped like a stone, without a sound. The second man heard the thump and turned, his eyes wide with terror, as he saw Koa standing there, a figure of righteous fury against the falling snow. He fumbled for his pistol. He was too slow. Koa closed the distance in 2 strides. He didn't use his rifle. He used his hands. The hands that had built a cabin, tended horses, and held his dying wife. He grabbed the man by the throat, lifted him off his feet, and slammed him against the canyon wall. The man's pistol clattered to the ground. "You came to the wrong mountain," Koa rasped, his voice a low growl of compressed rage. He looked into the man's terrified eyes and saw the pathetic, greedy soul within. He could have ended him right there. The warrior in him screamed for it. But then he heard Lydia's voice. "Koa, don't!" He looked over and saw her on her feet, her face bruised but her eyes clear. Seeing her, alive and safe, broke the spell of his rage. He let the man slide down the rock face, gasping and choking. He wouldn't kill them. He wouldn't become the monster they had tried to make him. He tied them up, using their own belts. He left them there in the snow. The authorities at Fort Stanton could come and collect them. Justice would be served, but it wouldn't be by his hand. He walked to Lydia. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before he gently brushed a strand of hair from her bruised cheek. "I thought I lost you," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "You came back," she said, her voice trembling as she leaned into his touch. "You came back for me." "I always will," he said. And in that moment, standing in the cold canyon with the taste of battle in the air, he knew it was true. He was done running. He helped her onto his horse, then climbed up behind her, his arms circling her protectively. As they rode back toward the cabin under a sky full of stars, the silence between them wasn't empty. It was full. Full of a past they now shared, and the promise of a future he had never believed he would have. The ghost of the mountain was finally riding home, but this time he wasn't alone. And for the first time in a very long time, he was ready for the spring. The fire burned bright in the hearth, chasing the shadows from the corners of the cabin. Koa cleaned and stitched the cut on Lydia's cheek with a gentle hand, his touch surprisingly deft for a man whose life had been so hard. She sat perfectly still, her eyes never leaving his face. "You were wrong," she said quietly when he was finished. He looked up from his work. "About what?" "You told me your world only ruins what it touches," she said. "Tonight, you saved me." He tied off the last stitch, his gaze softening. "Tonight, you saved me too." He knew now that if he had returned to an empty cabin, a part of him would have died that could never be brought back. She had given him something to fight for, something to live for. He stood and walked to the small juniper box where he kept Naima's things. He opened it and took out a simple silver ring. He had hammered it himself from a silver dollar all those years ago. He walked back to Lydia and knelt before her. He took her hand, his thumb gently stroking her knuckles. "This life," he began, his voice low and steady, "is not easy. This land is hard, and I am an old man, full of scars and memories." "I know," she whispered, tears shining in her eyes. "But if you'll have me," he continued, his voice thick with emotion, "if you'll share this quiet and this solitude with me, I will spend every sunrise I have left making sure you never feel cold or alone again." He slipped the silver ring onto her finger. Lydia, will you be my wife? Her answer was a choked sob as she threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder. Yes, she wept. Yes. They were married a week later, as the last of the snow melted and the first green shoots of spring pushed through the earth. The preacher came up from the fort, and a few old friends from the valley stood as witnesses. Lydia wore a dress she had sewn from spare linen, and in her hair she wore the first wild flowers of the season. Koa stood beside her, his hand in hers, and felt a peace he had thought was lost to him forever. He looked at her, at the way the sunlight caught the gold in her hair, and he knew he was home. Not the cabin, not the mountain. Her. She was his home. That night, as they sat by the fire, her head resting on his chest, he listened to the steady rhythm of her heart. The wind outside was gentle, a soft whisper through the pines. It no longer sounded like a lament for what was lost. It sounded like a promise of what was to come. I love you, Koa Redhawk, she murmured, her voice sleepy. He held her tighter, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. He couldn't remember the last time he had said the words himself, but they came to him now, as easy as breathing. I love you, too. The storm was finally over. The long winter of his heart had ended, and as he looked into the flames, he didn't see the ghosts of the past anymore. He saw the warm, bright, beautiful future he had been given a second chance to build. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales from the shadows of the past.